Could you face to face the last words of a condemned man? At the precise moment when the heart stops and the light goes out, he raised his voice, fragile as a thread of ice. I didn't kill alone. I was just the first. It was a psychological blow so cruel that no one could decipher it. Was it a final confession or a silent threat? Stay with me until the end. What you'll discover now may surprise you. The metallic clang of the door closing, sweat dripping down her temple. The needle sliding treacherously across pale skin. Amid the whirring of the machines, that sentence tore through the air. Criminal psychology at its rawest, unburdened by remorse, just a cold warning. Have you ever been there? Ever felt the anguish of a lie disguised as truth? The execution scene wasn't just a final ritual. It was a stage where every detail seemed choreographed to maintain silence about something much greater. The cold lights illuminated his face, marked by guilt and coldness. The gentle clapping of the jailer, the distant click of the camera, the muffled sound of breathing in the room. And there, before the life escaped his body, he broke protocol. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a whisper of terror. They're still out there. That moment, that final confession, went down in true crime history as a riddle buried alive. As blood flowed and consciousness faded, words became blades. Each syllable cut through the illusion of a closed case. Criminal psychology in action. Unanswered questions, names uninvestigated. Bodies that disappeared into dusty police files. Do you feel the tension tightening in your chest? Is curiosity throbbing in your head? The truth no one wanted to reveal begins to take shape in your mind. True crimes take on darker tones when we hear the voice of someone who has crossed the final line between life and death. And in that split second, he went from convicted criminal to harbinger of a macabre conspiracy. It wasn't just the execution of a man. It was the consummation of a pact of silence. Where authorities remained silent, headlines disappeared, and investigations were abruptly halted. But the pain that never goes away, and the isolation of those seeking justice intensified. In that somber courtroom, the victim's memories whispered that something was wrong. But few dared listen. The shock of the revelation reached through the prison bars and hit the retired investigator who dedicated decades to cold cases. He felt the weight of guilt for having ignored patterns, the clues destroyed by bureaucracy, the witnesses who remained silent. The controversy laid bare in the pages of the case file. Conflicting versions, evidence manipulation, indications of more guilty parties, authority against authority. Truths buried for self-interest. And now you're here, faced with this fragmented narrative about to plunge into the depths of hell that begins with one sentence. I didn't kill alone. The execution was only the apparent endpoint. The real paragraph remains open. The next chapter will bring revelations that challenge everything you believe about justice and punishment. Stay with me until the next moment. Prepare to feel chills. Prepare to question every solved case that has passed through your timeline. Because this isn't a simple criminal psychology report. It's a disturbing invitation to face the system that preferred silence to confronting the truth. And what comes next will reveal names, dates, and places that reignite the flame of an investigation that should never have been closed. The town was too small to contain so much silence. Small enough for everyone to know the victim's face, but large enough to hide the killer's name. The year was 1998, a sweltering summer in rural Texas, and the body found behind an abandoned school felt not just like the end of a life, but the beginning of a message. Her name was Lindsay Mae Thompson, 17 years old, light-colored hair, a smile straight out of an evangelical church catalog. The kind of girl who seemed to live inside a family portrait. But what they found next to her body shattered any semblance of normalcy. A red flower, placed between her fingers. A note with 2 words, first chance. The brutality of the crime paralyzed the county. Precise cuts, No blood at the scene, no sign of a struggle. Forensics suggested she was killed elsewhere and positioned there, almost like a sculpture, a trophy. Psychologically, the killer didn't just want to kill, he wanted to show off, to control the narrative, to direct the scene as if it were a macabre film. The investigations, as always, began with the most obvious. Names: ex-boyfriend, neighbor, teacher. Everyone was interviewed. No real clues. But there was a bigger problem. No one seemed willing to face what the murder screamed. It wasn't random. It had a signature. And worse, it had a promise. Weeks later, another girl disappeared. Same profile, same age, same neighborhood. But this time, no body. Just a backpack discarded in a supermarket parking lot, with a red rose crumpled between the notebooks. The police denied any connection between the cases. They called it a cruel coincidence. And they moved on. This is where criminal psychology begins to scream louder than technical reports. Because every patterned killer has a ritual. And every ritual stems from an obsession. What seemed like an isolated crime gradually became a game piece by piece. And the city was just the board. The years dragged on. The bodies dwindled. But the disappearances didn't. Until in 2003, in a village 40 minutes away, they found a new victim. Same age, same pattern, and the same red flower. It was as if someone were collecting memories of lives cut short. And yet, the system insisted on separating the cases. Different regions, different victims, different contexts, they said. But anyone familiar with human behavior knew the signature was the same. They just didn't want to see it. It was at this point that a name began to emerge, not as a direct culprit, but as a constant presence. In schools, in churches, in markets. A face too common to attract attention. He was present at funerals, searches, and testimonies. Always close, always helpful, always silent. In 2004, he was arrested for another crime of violent robbery. During the investigation, detectives found old newspaper clippings, only of specific victims, black and white photos, some hand-drawn. One of them had her eyes crossed out with a red marker. To any layman, this was eerie. But to those who understand the inner workings of the criminal mind, it was the equivalent of an intimate confession. The secret work of a murderous ego. The interrogation was brief. The confession ... incomplete. He admitted to Lindsay's murder, but denied involvement in the other cases. He said he acted alone. He said it was a fit of rage. But when asked about the red flower and the note, he simply replied, "I needed to score." It was the first chance that dismantled any police theory. Because if there was a first, there was also a second, and a third, and perhaps more than that. There were other hands. Other minds, other eyes watching. The prosecution closed the case as a single murder. They dismissed any evidence of connection to the others. They called the objects found a symbolic delusion. But within the prosecutor's confidential file, there was an unfiled document, a list of 5 names. One of them crossed out. The others, alive, intact, free. Because when you look at the decisions made behind the scenes of this trial, you realize that the most brutal crime may not have been the murder, but the deliberate choice to suppress the truth. And that choice had consequences. Consequences that left scars not just on a city, but on the entire logic of American criminal justice. Because what seemed like a resolved investigation was actually a curtain pulled back the wrong way. And behind it, there was still a lot of darkness. The arrest took place on a rainy Tuesday, the kind where the asphalt seems to reflect more than the eyes. The handcuffed man could barely keep his gaze steady, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. His face was haggard, his clothes stained, his past tangled in debt, alcohol, and screams. He was the kind of figure who fit perfectly into the narrative the city needed to breathe again. The easy culprit. The monster shaped by his own abandonment. His name was Elias Crane, 36 years old, unemployed. He lived in a precarious structure, a makeshift shipping container on a vacant lot at the edge of the county. A place where poverty didn't need to hide it became the setting. With a history of assault, a history of theft, and neighbors who said, "I always thought it was strange," Elias became the ideal vessel for collective fear. A name was enough. A record was enough. A rush was enough. The confession came quickly. Too quickly. But not with the desperation of someone trying to escape. It had a strange tone, like someone admitting guilt, but leaving the door open. He didn't deny involvement. He admitted to having participated in Lindsay's death. But when asked if he acted alone, he didn't hesitate. "No, I was just the one who fell first." That sentence should have stopped the process. In any serious investigation, it would have become the guiding principle for the next stage. But in that weary courtroom, with a prosecutor hungry to close the case, that sentence became a footnote. Elias wasn't someone the system cared about. He was disposable, reprehensible, ideal for a quick fix, a press conference, a sigh of relief for the mayor and the newspapers. During the hearing, he made a condition. He said he would hand over names, people who were also there, people who participated. "I want you to hear the names I say. Then, do whatever you want with me." The request was recorded, but never considered. The underpaid and overworked public defender didn't even insist. The sheets with the names were attached to the case file without investigation. 3 months later, they disappeared from the records, but the story didn't disappear. It shifted. Behind the scenes, rumors began to swirl. A clerk at the registry office said he'd seen the list. He remembered one of the names. It was a retired police officer known for extortion and erratic behavior. Another name seemed familiar. The assistant to a local pastor, involved with young people in social programs. All profiles seemingly unsuspecting at first glance, seen in a different light, revealed a silent network of power and manipulation. Elias was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of appeal. The case was officially closed. The community celebrated. The media moved on. But something remained displaced, the very fabric of truth. Because while Elias rotted behind bars, other names continued attending services, visiting schools, and running for public office. The psychology behind this systemic choice is disturbing. It's easier to believe in a single culprit than to face the possibility of a network. The collective mind prefers a concrete face, even if imperfect, to the paralyzing uncertainty of multiple predators acting in silence. And when that face is poor, unstable, and marked by previous mistakes, condemnation becomes almost automatic, not out of justice, but out of convenience. The hidden truth is that, in most serial crimes, there's always a link that offers itself as a sacrifice, one who fell through stupidity, impulse, or bad luck. And the true architects, those who plan, observe, and feed on the chaos, continue to operate in the shadows. Justice in this case isn't blind. It simply turns a blind eye by choice. 5 years after Elias's arrest, a retired investigator decided to revisit the case on his own. Obsessed with overlooked patterns, he began mapping the disappearance locations, dates, and coincidences. He discovered that all the points of contact led to a group of 5 people who ran in the same social circle. They were discreet but visible. They were common but constant. A teacher, a police officer, a city employee, a religious leader, and a school bus driver. All of them had crossed paths with at least 2 victims, but none of them were formally questioned. While analyzing the old files, the researcher found something that chilled him to the core. An unofficial copy of the list written by Elias rescued by a courthouse intern before it was destroyed. 4 names matched the profiles mapped, and the 5th was Elias himself. He never cleared himself. You never tried to clear yourself. He just wanted the full story to come out. But the city wouldn't listen, the court wouldn't see, and the system never wanted to open that door. Because what lies behind this pattern isn't just a failure of justice. It's a conscious, systematic choice to protect structures. And those who truly want justice must learn to face the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the convicted killer isn't the most dangerous. He's just the most exposed, the weakest, the most expendable. And meanwhile, the true faces behind the horror continue to smile for the cameras in broad daylight. The most disturbing detail is that Elias never defended himself. He never tried to point the finger as a victim. He just wanted to be heard. What he wrote before the trial was a poorly read request, or perhaps deliberately ignored. And this reveals more about how justice works than any sentence. Because when someone living on the margins finally speaks, the structure prefers silence. While the public's eyes were on the court, behind the scenes, time worked in favor of those who truly had something to hide. Documents disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. Entire files were lost in administrative transfers. It was as if the case were being dismantled piece by piece, until only what served the official narrative remained: a poor, violent, dangerous, and conveniently isolated man. It's at this point that everything starts to hurt differently. Because you realize this isn't just old history. It's a wound still open, still throbbing. And every time someone decides to dig deeper, the answers seem to slip away. And you feel that too, don't you? This desire to understand, to go beyond what you've been told. Because there's something here that won't close. Something that bothers you. That's why, if you've made it this far, I need to tell you something important. Your presence makes a difference. This channel exists to tell stories that many would rather bury, to unearth truths beneath the reports. And if you want to continue following these leads, delving deeper into these cases with us, subscribe now. Not as just another number, but as part of a community that doesn't accept easy versions. Because there's so much more to come. Things that haven't yet come to light, names that still need to be exposed, details that are being revealed little by little, and you'll want to be here when they do. Each entry is more than a click. It's a clear sign that this kind of investigation matters, that these forgotten voices deserve to be heard. That's what keeps this work alive, and that's what will take us even deeper into this spiral of revelations. And believe me, what remains to be told is what scares us most. Because not all the faces behind these crimes are strangers. Some you've seen. Some you still see every day. Now that you understand how everything began to unravel, I want to delve even deeper into the silent decisions that sealed the fate of more victims. Decisions made behind locked doors, protected by uniforms, titles, and churches. Decisions that left traces. And it is through these traces that the next part of the story begins to unfold. The page was written with a shaky hand, but the intention was firm. 7 names. 7 letters that together didn't form a plea for clemency. They formed a ticking time bomb. Elias no longer wanted to negotiate his innocence. There was nothing left to save. What he wanted in that final moment of exposure was to reveal the trail, to reveal the map to a truth no one was willing to follow. He wrote a barely discernible sentence in the bottom corner of the note: "They are everywhere except where you look." And when he handed the paper to the prosecutor, the silence that filled the room wasn't one of tension. It was one of discomfort. The kind of discomfort that only appears when an inconvenient truth knocks on the door of those who profit from the lie. The prosecutor didn't hesitate. He picked up the note with 2 fingers, as if it were something dirty, disgusting. He tore it into 4 parts. He said loudly, almost theatrically, "This is fiction. It's cheap theater." The pieces of paper were shoved into the trash as if they were worthless. But there, in that gesture, was everything. The contempt wasn't just for Elias, it was for what he knew. For what he could make crumbled out. The system doesn't like surprises, and even less so narratives that get out of hand. A poor, dirty, wandering killer was useful. A possible informant from a structured network? No, that complicates things. That scares. That demands investigation, reopening, exposure. And exposing the system itself is always the last step, which almost never happens. Elias didn't protest. He didn't plead. He didn't even look at the audience or the judges. He just leaned back in his chair with a half smile. The kind of smile that doesn't express joy, but disdain. Disdain for knowing he was right, and that no one would dare admit it, but someone saw it. A 19-year-old intern working in the archives. He saw the note being torn up, and before the cleaning was done, he rummaged through the trash. He picked up the pieces, reassembled them with tape, and photographed them. He hid those images for years. Only in 2011 did he find the courage to share them with the retired investigator who was still obsessed with the case. And there, names began to make sense. One of the names belonged to a man who worked with at-risk youth. Another to a prison chaplain with a history of helping inmates. Another to a former military officer who was allowed to circulate between police departments as a volunteer consultant. People who were always close to the system, but never under suspicion. It was as if the predator had learned to wear the uniform of authority and no one dared question it. This is the sickest part of the journey, understanding that sometimes the monster doesn't hide in the alleys. He attends meetings, takes selfies with politicians, receives Citizen of the Year awards. And all of this creates a layer of symbolic protection so dense that even when someone tries to scream, the scream echoes alone. It's like hitting a glass wall. You can see through, but you can't get through. When the investigator compared the names with old records of disappearances and unsolved incidents, he discovered that everyone listed by Elias had been mentioned in different contexts. None had been indicted. None had been questioned. But all of them ... always around. The pattern of behavior was devious. The victims had specific profiles. Vulnerable young people, in emotional or social transition, easy to isolate. Always women, always between 14 and 19 years old. All with a history of therapy, domestic abuse, or school problems. Ideal profiles for someone who knows how to hunt without leaving a trace. And when one of the names died in a car accident in 2009, the system breathed a sigh of relief. But the relief was short-lived. Because with his death, a series of documents were found in his home. Letters, photographs, newspaper clippings with faces marked. 3 of the faces were of known victims. But there were 2 who had never appeared in any investigation. And this raised an uncomfortable question. How many disappeared and were never even registered? This is where transformation comes in. Because when you understand that not every crime is recorded, not every disappearance is reported, and not every victim has a face, reality changes, the mindset changes. And what was once just another crime story begins to reveal itself as a structural flaw, a network of omissions that protects predators while crushing the invisible. Because the decisions that followed this revelation not only reinforced the silence, they transformed that silence into policy, into a norm, into a shield. The hidden truth became protected by votes, positions, and rituals of power. And understanding this is essential for anyone who wants to see beyond the headlines. Stay with me until the end. Because what you're about to discover contains names, dates, and connections that have never been publicly revealed. And perhaps, after this, you'll never look at people smiling in official photos the same way again. In the months following Elias's arrest, the city tried to move on. Supermarkets once again played ambient music. Churches reopened their doors on Sundays, and newspapers began covering inaugurations, school parties, and political speeches with staged smiles. But there was something beneath the surface. A subtle, almost imperceptible tension that permeated conversations, as if the entire city knew, deep down, that the math wasn't adding up but preferred to pretend it did. The problem was the pattern, because it never stopped. It continued there, seeping through the city's corners like a slow poison. Every 3 or 4 weeks, a new disappearance. Sometimes the body was found days later, sometimes never. And when it was, the state always said the same thing: suicide, voluntary escape, emotional breakdown. Death certificates were filled with words that numbed the emergency room, and investigations were closed before they even began, but it was impossible not to notice. The victims had the same profile: young women between 15 and 20 years old, with some history of emotional vulnerability. Many frequented the same spaces: community centers, smaller churches, social shelters, and the places where they were last seen almost always revolved around the same urban perimeter. An area forgotten in the municipal plan, where small rehabilitation projects, private spiritual shelter initiatives, and poorly monitored NGOs were concentrated. Everything was very accessible. Everything was very clean on the outside. But there was a structural filth that didn't show in the light of day. When the retired investigator, the same one who had recovered Elias's list, decided to map the cold cases of the last 10 years, what he found was stifling. The geolocation of the missing victims traced a nearly perfect ring. A circle centered at a precise point, a former decommissioned school that, according to records, had been in city ownership but unused since 1996, an abandoned building obscured by tall weeds, graffiti, and broken windows, but with clear signs of recent activity. On the side wall, barely visible beneath the layers of dirt and age, was a mark drawn in black ink, a strange, rudimentary symbol, as if made by someone in a state of emergency. What was most striking wasn't the drawing itself, but the fact that it also appeared in 2 other locations where bodies were found. Coincidence? No, it was a signature. It was a ritual. The pattern now wasn't just psychological. It was physical, real, tangible, and to ignore it was at the very least complicity. But why didn't anyone investigate? Why didn't any local reporters pursue these leads? The answer lay behind the scenes, always behind the scenes. In meetings whose minutes weren't recorded, in unrecorded phone calls, in agreements that left no trace. People who held positions in different institutions were somehow interconnected. There were links between those who released funds, those who led the social centers, those who coordinated the searches, and most importantly, those who decided when a case should be closed. It was an ecosystem of silence, fueled by fear, political interests, and long-standing favors. And anyone who dared question it disappeared from office, lost their reputation, or was simply discredited. Turning these clues into charges was nearly impossible because each piece was shielded by carefully constructed layers of legality. There was no sufficient evidence, only fragments, insinuations, uncomfortable gaps that, if connected, revealed something too big to ignore, but small enough to be forgotten, if convenient. Meanwhile, families continued to leave portraits on lampposts, candles on sidewalks, crumpled notes on gates. Mothers sought answers in support groups, religious gatherings, and desperate letters sent to local radio stations. The city, officially, didn't comment. It didn't connect the cases. Each disappearance was treated as unique, isolated, disconnected from everything that came before. But in the corridors of those who truly observed, the feeling was clear. Someone, or some, were operating under the cover of collective indifference, because this pattern is no coincidence. It reveals a rotten mentality, one that normalizes loss as long as it's silent, discreet, and doesn't affect important figures. It's the kind of truth that doesn't show up in statistics, but reveals itself in the weariness of faces, the silence of investigations, the rush to close poorly told stories, And the question that keeps coming back, why close so many cases with such clear patterns? Who benefits from this? And most disturbingly, who else is involved? Because when the methods are the same, the victims follow the same profile, and the locations are the same, it's no longer a coincidence, it's a project, an engineering of disappearance, a hidden manual on how to erase without a trace. Stay with me until the end, because there's more. And what you'll see next not only reinforces everything we've already shown, but also reveals the name no one wanted to say out loud, the name that has always been there, circulating among victims, investigators, and forgotten records. The name that may finally hold the key to this story. The visit was scheduled in silence. No formal record, no official date in the prison records, but it happened. A sultry, windless afternoon in the concrete corridor where time stands still. Elias already knew what was coming. He didn't ask why. He simply sat behind the thick glass, with the dead look of someone who no longer expects anything, but still hides something. On the other side, two faces. One man with a stole askew around his neck, the other with a posture too straight for someone retired. A priest and a former police officer. No one quite understood why they went together, but they both went in and asked that their conversation not be recorded. The prison guard hesitated. Then he left. It was the former police officer who spoke first, not with anger nor with pity, but with a cold urgency. He leaned forward slightly across the table and said, "Are you saying the others are still killing?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He just tilted his head to the side, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then he smiled. A small smile, but enough to freeze the air. They never stopped. The priest shifted in his chair. He crossed his arms. He tried to figure out if that was irony or a form of confession. But Elias was no longer interested in convincing anyone. He had already said all he needed to. Now he just watched the others desperately try to piece together the pieces he himself had thrown to the floor. One by one, the police officer insisted, "You could have given up everything. The names, the places, you could have made a deal." But Elijah laughed for the first time in days. A hollow laugh. "Do you think anyone would have listened? You saw what they did with that paper. I'm not the problem. I was the audition." This phrase echoed for days in the minds of both men. I was the test. What was Elias trying to say with this? That he was the first? The scapegoat? Or worse, the only disposable in the chain? The police officer left the penitentiary with heavy shoulders. The priest stayed a while longer, trying to talk. He talked about redemption, the soul, the final judgment. Elias just watched, in silence. Finally, before leaving, the priest asked if he wanted to confess anything. Elias looked up for the last time and said, "I have nothing to confess. I just did what I was told." That wasn't an excuse. It was another key. Because if he was instructed, trained, or led, then there was something much bigger than anyone there was willing to accept. An invisible structure working like a cog behind the deaths. A chain that wasn't sustained by impulse, but by command. And Elias was merely the executor. This revelation changed the former police officer's mindset. He began sifting through old files on his own. He searched for prison visitation records, connections between inmates and religious institutions, and incomplete reports. He found flaws, many. He discovered that, in the years before Lindsay's crime, Elias had participated in a social reintegration program run by an NGO linked to a local church. The same church where two of the people on Elias's list volunteered. The coincidence was impossible to swallow. More than that, there were photographs of community gatherings. In one, Elias appears in a circle with other young people. In the background, a man who has been identified in more than one disappearance as the last person to see the victim. He was never indicted, nor named in the case, but he was there, smiling. As always, this chain of connections began to form a web of profound impact. These were no longer just isolated deaths. It was a network of grooming, a strategy of emotional isolation. Young women in crisis were being lured into support programs run by people with questionable backgrounds, with no oversight, no records. Many of them came from abusive backgrounds. Most had no parents present. They were the perfect prey. And the predators were disguised as pastors, counselors, therapists. People who talked about healing, but acted like they owned the pain. Most disturbing was how often the victims changed their behavior shortly before disappearing. Some left letters, others left rambling notes. Repeated words like, "I can't talk. Something is wrong." They know everything, but no one took it seriously. They said it was teenage drama, emotional outbursts. They ignored it. They ignored them all, because there's a place in this story where everything converges. A house, a foundation, a ruined building that bears on its walls the fingerprints of what was hidden. It's not just about who killed. It's about who allowed it, who financed it, who silenced it. This is the most dangerous part, and perhaps the most revealing. Because what's buried there isn't just evidence. It's a choked cry of all the voices that were silenced, waiting, even today, for someone with the courage to listen. And perhaps the cruelest thing is realizing how all this passed before our eyes, how the names were there, the faces circulated, the patterns screamed. And yet, no one wanted to really look, because looking demands responsibility. It demands action. And it's more comfortable to live in ignorance than to carry the weight of a truth that forces you to change. But there's something most people forget. These stories don't just belong to the victims. They also belong to those who feel, to those who recognize a piece of their own in the pain of others, to those who, at some point in their lives, have been silenced, or ignored, or disbelieved. And that's why I want to ask you for something different now. No rush, no pressure. Just a gesture that for many may seem small, but which for this space here has immense meaning. Write in the comments, in your own words, what this story sparked inside you. It could be a memory, a lingering indignation, or even a single word that represents how you felt upon hearing all of this. If you want, just leave the sentence, "They never stopped." If this phrase resonated with you, if it seems to echo something you've experienced, seen, or felt, write it down. It can be anonymous, it can be simple. But when you write, you transform this video into a real connection. And that makes a difference. Because when these voices meet, the truth stops being a whisper. It becomes a body. It becomes a force. Many people read the comments later. And perhaps someone who needs to hear exactly what you have to say will find there what they couldn't find anywhere else. Sometimes, venting can be the only bridge between someone and the courage to move on. And yes, your voice matters. Because this story doesn't end with a name. It continues in every person who still carries unanswered questions, unsaid pains, long-held suspicions, and that knot in their stomach that never quite goes away. And if you felt this at some point, then you're already a part of it all. Now that the names have started to emerge, I need to show you where it all comes together, where silence became protection, and where the last body appeared with a detail that changes everything. 2 months. That was the exact time between Elias's execution and Lara's disappearance. 17 years old, a student, she lived with her grandparents. She had never been involved in drugs, never had a criminal record, nor any history to justify what happened. She simply vanished, leaving her night school like so many others before her. The route was the same every day. 4 poorly lit blocks, a corner with a broken camera, and the iron gate of the technical school where she studied. That night, the corner camera showed the shape of a white van driving slowly past. It stopped for exactly 7 seconds, then it moved on. It was impossible to see who was inside. But the most disturbing detail is that, at that same spot, 3 years earlier, another young woman disappeared. Also at night. Also after school. Also after a white van slowed down and disappeared into the darkness. Lara was found 5 days later, in a densely wooded area 22 kilometers from the city center. She was posed like a doll, her hands crossed over her chest, and a cut on her face, close to the jaw, repeated with surgical precision. The same cut described in 3 previous cases, including Lindsay's. The same cut Elias couldn't have known about, because he was already in prison before those victims emerged. At the autopsy, another shock. Lara had traces of sedative in her blood, a rare type for veterinary use, not sold without a license. No clue, no fingerprints, no trace, just the same pattern. And a school notebook in her backpack with a sentence written in pen on the bottom corner of the last page. You are not the first. That broke the last of the retired investigator's silence. It was no longer paranoia. It wasn't obsession. It was continuity. A cycle that wasn't broken by the execution, because the execution was never the end. It was just a cover-up for a much larger scheme. And it continued to operate. 3 weeks later, another disappearance. Gabriel, 15 years old. History of anxiety. Last known location, a municipal shelter, after running away from home due to family disputes. He was taken in by a teen that, according to records, never existed. The name of the social worker who signed him into the shelter ... was one of the names on Elias's list. The same name that appeared in a report filed years earlier, involving psychological abuse of minors. Gabriel was never seen again. His record was deleted 3 days after he entered the system. Officially, he was never admitted to the shelter. When his grandparents sought answers, they received only a standard report: runaway minor. The case was closed due to lack of evidence. Once again, history repeated itself. Not as a failure but as a strategy, because these repetitions aren't random, they follow a plan. An engineering of invisibility based on manipulated statistics, fragile structures, and intentional omissions. When you look behind the scenes, you realize the problem was never a lack of evidence, but a lack of will. The system only investigates what it wants to see, and what it refuses to see accumulates in the dark. Each new disappearance seems to feed this invisible machine. Faceless young people with similar stories left on the margins. And always someone involved with some kind of power, minor authorities, charismatic religious figures, technicians from institutions living in the shadow of public funds. People who know the flaws. People who know how to manipulate reports, cover their tracks, silence voices. And the inevitable question is, for how long? How many bodies will need to be found before someone breaks this cycle? Or worse, how many bodies will never be found? Because the truth no one wants to say out loud is simple. Elijah may have killed, but he was never the only one. He was never the end. He was just the first dot, and that changes everything. 20 years, 2 decades. Enough time for the dust of oblivion to settle in the darkest corners of police files. For names to disappear from reports and faces to become mere statistics. But for the retired investigator, time didn't extinguish the flame of doubt. Quite the opposite. It grew, burned, and became a silent obsession. A weight he couldn't shake. He returned because something didn't fit. Because the puzzle pieces remained scattered, incomplete, waiting for someone to dare to peer behind the scenes, where the shadows are thickest and the secrets are cruelest. Returning wasn't just an act of justice. It was a call to transform a stagnant journey into a genuine search for the hidden truth. At first, he couldn't even imagine what he would find. Moldy interrogation tapes, files from investigations that were never followed up, evidence that had been carefully stored in locked drawers, away from the public eye, or rather, away from those who mattered. A collection of silences that screamed for justice, but the most terrifying discovery came at the end of the third week. Among the yellowed papers and distorted recordings was a list, an unofficial, undocumented list with 4 names hand-highlighted, 4 of the 7 names on Elias's note. And the worst news, they were alive and at large, not dead, not arrested, not even monitored, and more than that, they lived in the shadows of the very system that pretended to combat them. They were invisible figures amidst the crowd, protected by layers of bureaucracy and omission. Men who bore the appearance of ordinary citizens, but behind closed doors, maintained the power to continue the same dark journey Elias had denounced. A journey of manipulation, control, and death. This discovery wasn't just a shock, it was an earthquake, because it dismantled the official narrative, dismantled the sense of closure. It showed that justice had, in fact, been a stage, a spectacle to calm the masses while the real problem continued to grow, and the investigator knew that. Opening this Pandora's box meant putting his own life at risk. He knew that behind the scenes of that network, there were eyes and ears everywhere. That many didn't want him to go beyond the surface. But there was something inside him, an internal transformation, that wouldn't let him back down. The need to give voice to the silent voices, to expose the dark corridors where fear became law. Among the tapes, an even more disturbing revelation. Several of them had sections cut out. Moments when the interrogated person's voice abruptly stopped, or answers were replaced by silence and static. Excerpts that were never turned over to the prosecution. And the names mentioned in these excerpts? Those 4, precisely. Witnesses who could open doors, change the course of the case, and bring down the house of cards of impunity, but the recordings were incomplete. The gaps formed an even more cruel puzzle, a structure constructed so that the truth would never be reached. It was a power game in which time and silence played on the side of those who didn't want to be found. Behind it all, a mentality that perpetuated the cycle. The mindset that the problem could be contained by eliminating the first, the perfect culprit. But in practice, this meant burying the problem under a pile of documents and empty speeches. That investigator's journey wasn't just about finding evidence or names. It was about understanding the decisions that shaped the case, the behind-the-scenes choices that determined who lives and who dies. The invisible impact of these decisions on the lives of families, communities, and even the entire city's sense of security. Because when you begin to see behind the scenes, the journey of obscure decisions, the transformation of truth into silence, you understand that nothing is simple. That hidden truth is a powerful force, capable of shaking structures and transforming destinies. And it is precisely at this point that revelations begin to take shape, revelations that should never have been hidden, but which are now about to emerge in all their force. Stay with me until the end, because this story has more than names and disappearances. It has faces, strategies, and secrets that few have had the courage to face. And what comes next may forever change your understanding of justice, guilt, and impunity. Silence has always been impunity's most faithful ally. And in the case involving Elias, Lara, Gabriel, and so many others whose names are not even known, the silence gained its own strength, almost like an entity controlling the pace of events behind the scenes. Police, media, courts, all, to a greater or lesser extent, tuned into the same melody, that of convenience. A symphony that played to maintain superficial order, even as cracks grew beneath and threatened to collapse. At first, the police treated the reports as bureaucratic, just another case to be shelved. It wasn't the first time young people had disappeared in that region. The investigation system was already overwhelmed. Resources were scarce, and above all, the pressure to deliver quick results was immense. A quick result, in this case, meant finding a culprit, a simple explanation, and a swift outcome. Anything that would avoid in-depth questioning or exposing structural flaws. That's how Elias became the perfect culprit. A poor guy with a violent and unstable history, caught red-handed, with a note no one wanted to read properly. The official version didn't need to be more complex than that. It was enough to calm the population and ensure a sense of justice, however fragile, however partial. The press embraced this version with gusto. Easy headlines, ready-made phrases, and a script that sold. Justice served. End of the nightmare. The monster is trapped. But the media, like the police, also had its limits. The truth, however, shocking, was too uncomfortable to make headlines. Short stories replaced in-depth investigations. Sensationalist reports hid what really mattered. News consumers preferred the spectacle, the trial, the confession, the execution over the complexity of a system that deliberately failed. Courts, in turn, served as key components of this silence. Justice acted as if performing a ritual swift, effective, and invisible. Hearing officers, prosecutors, and judges who accepted superficial evidence and discarded documents chose to ignore the gaps. They preferred to close the case and move on, as if an inconvenient truth were better buried. The torn note, the cut tapes, the ignored names. All of this went up in smoke, disappeared into documents no one opened again. This silence didn't arise out of nowhere. It was cultivated, carefully cultivated, by interests that transcend the crime itself. There's a power play lurking between the lines, a game where political, financial, and social interests intersect, where the impact of a revelation can upend careers, affect entire groups, and rewrite narratives. And the system, even the one that should be the guardian of the truth, has become complicit, whether by omission, fear, or convenience. It's a portrait of the mindset that prefers to decide what the public can know, what the public should believe, and what should remain hidden. A mindset that turns truth into a bargaining chip, determining who deserves justice and who can remain invisible. And it is within this framework that the transformation of truth into silence perpetuates itself, creating a nearly endless cycle of concealment. The impact of this goes far beyond the direct victims. It reverberates through families who lose hope. It reverberates through the community, which lives under a veil of veiled fear and distrust. It reverberates through the very notion of justice, which erodes with each unresolved case, each name erased, each closed file. But this cycle isn't invincible. There are those who challenge the system, those who delve behind the scenes and don't conform to the official narrative. Those who understand that seemingly small decisions in private offices influence real lives. Those who know that, behind every silence, there's a hidden cry, a hidden truth, that if revealed, can provoke a profound transformation in the collective mindset. Because it's not just about understanding the system that chose silence, but about understanding the impact of that choice at every step of the investigation, in every judicial decision, in every omitted headline. This is the part of the story where the journey becomes personal, not just for those directly involved, but for everyone seeking true justice, for everyone who carries within themselves the desire to transform pain into action. Stay with me until the end, because next we'll go behind the scenes of the decisions that shaped this story, revealing the names, the encounters, the agreements, and the silences that defined the fate of so many lives. And these revelations may change everything you thought you knew until now. And in the midst of this invisible web, where every decision seems too heavy to unravel, it's easy to feel alone in the face of the complexity of the truth. But here, you're not. This is a space for those who want more, for those who seek the hidden layers, for those who won't accept silence as an answer. If this story stirs something within you, if you feel the urgency to understand the behind the scenes that others have tried to hide, then I want to invite you to be a more active part of this. Subscribe to continue this journey with me. It's not just a click. It's a commitment to the truth that's yet to come. Each video here is designed to reveal what few dare show, to bring to light what insists on remaining hidden. It's a space where you can experience revelations that will transform your perception of what really happens behind the curtains of the system, and what you'll discover in the next chapters could change everything. It could open doors to new questions, to concerns that shake our mindset and challenge us to question what seems obvious. The curiosity that unites us is the fuel for this transformation, and together we will explore every detail, every decision, and every secret that forms this hidden truth. If you feel this story has something to say to you, that it deserves to be followed to the end, then this channel is for you. Because here, more than just telling stories, we build a community that seeks to understand, reflect on, and transform. The impact of these narratives into awareness. Now, with this stronger connection, we will continue to uncover the behind the scenes, and this next stage will reveal names, encounters, and choices that change the course of this story. Revelations that, until now, have remained buried in silence. I was only the first. The phrase echoes in the mind like muffled thunder, a warning that cannot be ignored. It was not just the confession of a man about to meet his death, but a sentence that crossed time and the silent walls of justice to transform into a present constant shadow. That phrase ceased to be a delusion and became a dark omen, an open door to a labyrinth that few have the courage to explore. Looking back today, we realize that Elias's case was not an isolated incident, but the starting point of an invisible chain that still stretches through the city's fabric. The deaths, the disappearances, the forgotten faces, all of this forms a plot that didn't end with the court's final word or the lethal injection. The hidden truth is much deeper, much more painful. It seeps into the cracks of collective memory, into the gaps of decisions no one wanted to revisit. Each step of that journey reveals how the system reacted, not to dismantle the network, but to conceal it. Investigations were paused, evidence disappeared, voices were muffled. The impact of this was not only on those who lost their lives, but on every citizen who remains in the dark, unaware of how many monsters still lurk in the shadows. The mentality that perpetuates silence feeds on fear and convenience, creating fertile ground for the same stories to repeat themselves, as if time were a vicious cycle that leaves no room for transformation. But there is a faint thread of hope. That echo, once a lonely cry, gained strength with each person who refused to accept the official versions, with each investigator who dared to challenge the silence, with each person who questioned the decisions made hidden from the public eye. Revelations began to emerge, details that changed the course of the narrative, facts that exposed the cracks in the system. The journey to the truth also became a personal journey, an invitation to transform pain into action, fear into awareness. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the echo of that last sentence is understanding its impact on the lives still intersecting with this story, on the decisions that shape the future, and on the behind-the-scenes details that hold the greatest revelations. This is the time to face the complexity of the hidden truth, to unravel the mechanisms that keep this network alive, and to question what justice means in a scenario where silence seems to be the dominant protocol. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched something inside you, the sense that justice isn't always what it seems, and that behind every silence lies a conspiracy waiting to be revealed. If this touched you, leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." I want to know who's here, truly connected to this search for truth. And if this journey resonated with you, please like the video. Not out of obligation, but because this gesture shows that we're together in this mission to expose what they tried to hide. It's this connection that keeps the channel alive, that keeps us going, unafraid of the shadows. By the way, there's a video right here that complements exactly what we just saw. It will take you even deeper into this labyrinth of hidden truths and decisions that shape the fate of many lives. Click and stay with me there, because this story doesn't end here, it's just beginning.